had always known Dr. Preston as my husband's physician, a man who had been a steadfast presence in our lives for nearly 2 decades. At 66, he exuded an old-world charm that most men his age seemed to have lost, wearing his neatly pressed suits and carrying himself with a quiet confidence. He was thoughtful, meticulous, and dedicated, a far cry from the hurried doctors I'd encountered over the years. But to me, he had always been a professional figure, never anything more. That perspective changed the day of my checkup. My husband had insisted I see Dr. Preston for a general consultation after I'd been complaining of fatigue and headaches. It had been years since my last full exam, and I knew he was right, though I reluctantly agreed. The truth was, I felt vulnerable. My life had been in a sort of quiet chaos, a long stretch of unease I couldn't quite name, a restlessness I was too ashamed to share. The clinic felt cold and clinical as usual, but there was a peculiar warmth in Dr. Preston's presence. When he entered the room, his kind eyes crinkling behind his glasses, I felt an inexplicable wave of comfort. "Claire," he greeted, his deep, measured voice pulling me out of my thoughts. "It's been a while since I've had you here. Let's get you taken care of." I smiled politely, clasping my hands in my lap. "Thank you for fitting me in. It's no trouble. Your husband speaks highly of you. You're overdue for some self-care," he said, his tone gentle yet firm. His gaze lingered a beat too long before he flipped open my chart, a subtle shift that I dismissed as overthinking. The exam started with the usual questions: diet, sleep, stress levels, and I found myself unexpectedly candid. Something about the way he listened, his attention unwavering, made me spill more than I'd planned. I spoke about my insomnia, the weight of responsibilities at home, and the nagging sense that I had somehow lost myself in the years of marriage and routine. He nodded thoughtfully, pen poised above his clipboard. "You're carrying a lot, Claire. Have you been making time for yourself? Doing things that bring you joy?" I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I suppose not. It's just been difficult." Dr. Preston set his clipboard down, his gaze softening. "It's not uncommon, but it's not something to ignore either. Your health isn't just physical, it's everything, mind and body. We'll address all of it." His words felt intimate, almost too much for the sterile setting. I shifted uncomfortably, but nodded, grateful for his understanding. He stood then, gesturing toward the exam table. "Let's start with some basics. If you don't mind, I'll need you to slip into this gown." I took the garment he handed me, the brush of his fingers against mine, fleeting yet noticeable. He stepped out of the room to give me privacy, and I changed quickly, my cheeks warm. The gown felt flimsy, an inadequate shield against the vulnerability of the moment. When he returned, he moved with calm precision, his demeanor professional but unhurried. His touch was clinical at first, checking my blood pressure, testing reflexes, but as the exam progressed, I couldn't ignore the subtle shifts. His fingers brushed my skin with a gentleness that felt deliberate, lingering just a fraction too long. His eyes, though focused on his tasks, seemed to catch on mine more often than necessary. "Does this hurt?" he asked, pressing lightly along my abdomen. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't place. "No," I replied, my breath hitching involuntarily. His hand stilled, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged. He cleared his throat, stepping back abruptly. "Everything seems normal so far," he said, his tone returning to its usual professional cadence. "Let's move to the next part of the exam." I nodded, trying to calm the fluttering in my chest. As he guided me through each step, the room seemed to shrink, the boundaries between us growing hazier. When his hand brushed mine again, neither of us pulled away immediately. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice low. "It's fine," I said quickly, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. By the time the exam concluded, I felt lightheaded, though not from anything physical. I couldn't quite name what had passed between us, but it lingered as he handed me my chart and scheduled a follow-up. His fingers grazed mine again, this time deliberately, and his eyes held mine longer than they should have. "Take care of yourself, Claire," he said softly. I swallowed hard, nodding as I gathered my things. As I walked out of the clinic, my mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to confront. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't quite define, but couldn't ignore either. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The days after my appointment with Dr. Preston passed in a blur, yet his presence lingered in my mind with an intensity that unnerved me. My husband noticed my distracted state, but chalked it up to exhaustion, something I didn't correct. I told myself it was nothing, just a harmless moment of heightened awareness during the checkup. Yet the memory of his lingering gaze, the feather-light touch of his fingers, replayed in my thoughts more often than I cared to admit. When the reminder call for my follow-up came 2 weeks later, I almost canceled. It felt too personal, as though attending would solidify whatever this tension was. But a stronger part of me, one I wasn't entirely proud of, wanted to see him again. I told myself it was practical. I needed to prioritize my health. That reasoning, though flimsy, was enough to push me to show up. The clinic was quieter this time. Nearing the end of the day, the receptionist greeted me warmly and directed me to an exam room. I settled onto the chair, smoothing my skirt nervously, trying not to let my anticipation spiral into something irrational. The door opened softly, and there he was again, his presence filling the room with an unspoken gravity. His white coat was unbuttoned, revealing a crisp shirt and tie beneath, and his glasses perched lower on his nose, giving him a scholarly yet approachable air. "Blair," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that immediately unsettled me. "Good to see you again." "You too," I managed, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. He reviewed my chart with a practiced ease, his brow furrowing slightly as he read. "It seems the fatigue is still an issue." I nodded, clasping my hands together in my lap. "A bit. The headaches too, though not as frequent." He looked up then, his gaze piercing. "You need to give yourself more grace. Rest is as vital as anything I can prescribe." I forced a smile. Easier said than done. His lips quirked upward, but his expression quickly turned serious. "I'd like to run a few more tests today, if that's all right, just to rule out anything underlying." I agreed, and the familiar ritual of the exam began again. This time, though, the tension in the room was undeniable, thick enough to feel like a tangible force. Each touch, each word seemed imbued with an undercurrent neither of us acknowledged aloud. At one point, as he adjusted the blood pressure cuff around my arm, his fingers brushed the sensitive skin of my wrist. I felt a jolt, a shiver, that had nothing to do with the cold of the cuff. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice impossibly soft. I shook my head, unable to meet his eyes. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this felt fine. It felt charged, electric, as though the boundaries between us were dissolving in real time. When the preliminary checks were done, he stepped back, slipping his hands into his pockets. Before I proceed, is there anything else you'd like to share? Any symptoms or concerns you haven't mentioned? The question seemed loaded, though I knew it was routine. I hesitated, feeling the weight of his gaze on me, the sharp awareness that there was so much more I could say. But instead, I shook my head. No, nothing else, I said quietly, and then he nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. All right, let's proceed. The next part of the exam required me to lie back on the table, and I felt my pulse quicken as he adjusted the reclining seat. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the measured cadence of his voice explaining each step. But beneath that clinical veneer was something unspoken, something that hung in the air between us, like a question neither of us dared to ask. As he pressed gently along my abdomen, his touch was as professional as it had been during the first visit, yet it sent a ripple of heat through me. He paused briefly, glancing up at me, and our eyes met. It was fleeting, but undeniable, a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than it should have. You're tense, he said, his voice low. I exhaled shakily. I guess I am. Try to relax, he murmured, his tone impossibly soothing. His hands, warm and steady, applied a gentle pressure that only heightened my awareness of him. By the time he finished, my mind was spinning. I sat up slowly, feeling as though I'd just crossed an invisible threshold without even realizing it. All done, he said, stepping back and removing his gloves. You're in good health overall, Claire, but I still want to keep an eye on the fatigue and headaches. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and disappointment that the exam was over. He handed me my chart, his fingers brushing mine once again, and the look in his eyes was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was layered, complex, a mixture of concern, curiosity, and something deeper that I couldn't name. As I stood to leave, he hesitated. Claire, yes? I turned back to him, my heart pounding. His gaze held mine, and for a moment, I thought he might say something profound, something that would explain the inexplicable connection between us. But instead, he offered a small smile, his voice tinged with a warmth that sent a shiver down my spine. Take care of yourself. I nodded, my throat too tight to form a proper response, and left the room feeling as though the ground beneath me had shifted irreparably. The drive home was a haze, the weight of the encounter settling over me like a heavy cloak. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that the boundary between patient and doctor had not truly been breached. But deep down, I knew better. Something had begun, something I couldn't take back, and the thought both thrilled and terrified me. The days after my second visit to Dr. Preston felt surreal, as if I were living two lives. One was the familiar routine of being a wife, grocery runs, cleaning the house, making polite conversation with my husband. The other was an internal storm of emotions and desires I didn't fully understand. My thoughts kept circling back to the way Dr. Preston had looked at me, how his voice had softened when he said my name, and the way his eyes had lingered just long enough to send my pulse racing. I found myself replaying every detail of the exam in my mind, dissecting his expressions, his tone, his pauses. It was maddening, this fixation, but I couldn't stop. I started to wonder if he thought of me too, if the tension I felt between us was real or just a product of my imagination. The not knowing consumed me. When my phone buzzed with a call from his office a week later, my heart leapt to my throat. The nurse on the line explained that Dr. Preston had requested an additional follow-up to discuss some test results in person. The tone of her voice was casual, professional, but my mind raced with possibilities. I agreed to the appointment, my chest tight with both dread and anticipation. This time the clinic was even quieter. The receptionist barely looked up as she waved me toward the back, where Dr. Preston was waiting. The door to his office was open, and he stood by the window, his silhouette outlined by the fading light of the late afternoon. When he turned, his expression was unreadable, his eyes darker than I remembered. "Glare," he said, motioning for me to enter. "Come in." The room felt smaller than I'd remembered, or maybe it was the weight of his presence that made it seem that way. He gestured toward a chair, and I sat down, clutching my bag in my lap like a shield. "Is everything all right?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Yes," he said, taking his seat across from me. "Your tests came back normal. Physically, you're in excellent health, but there's something else I wanted to discuss." I swallowed hard, nodding. "Okay." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His gaze was intense, pinning me in place. "Claire, I've been doing this a long time. I can tell when someone is struggling, even when they don't say it outright." I looked away, his words hitting too close to home. "I'm fine," I said, though it sounded hollow, even to me. "You're not," he said firmly, but not unkindly. "And that's all right. It's why I'm here, to help." I couldn't meet his eyes. My defenses were crumbling, and I hated it. "I didn't come here for a therapy session." "I know," he said softly, "but sometimes it's hard to separate the physical from the emotional. You're carrying something heavy, Claire. I can see it." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt exposed, as though he could see every crack and flaw I'd spent years trying to hide. When I finally looked up, his expression was gentle, yet his gaze burned with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Is there something you're not telling me?" he asked, his voice low. For a moment, I considered spilling everything: the restlessness, the emptiness, the confusion that had consumed me since our last encounter. But instead, I shook my head. "No," I whispered. He didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. "Very well, let's go through a few more checks today. I want to be thorough." I followed him to the exam table, my pulse quickening as I climbed onto the familiar surface. This time, the atmosphere was different, heavier. His movements were slower, more deliberate, as though he was just as aware of the charged air between us as I was. When his hands rested on my shoulders to guide me back, I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. His fingers lingered, his grip firm, yet gentle, and when our eyes met, the unspoken tension between us seemed to crackle like static electricity. "Relax," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I tried to obey, but my body refused. Every touch, every brush of his hand against my skin sent my nerves into overdrive. As he adjusted the stethoscope against my chest, his fingers grazed my collarbone and I felt my breath hitch. "Deep breaths," he instructed, his tone steady, though his hand trembled ever so slightly as it moved to my wrist to check my pulse. I complied, but the closeness between us was unbearable. When he finally stepped back, I felt both relief and an inexplicable sense of loss. He turned to jot something down on his clipboard, his shoulders tense. "Is that all?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. He hesitated, then turned to face me fully. For a long moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice so quiet, it was almost a whisper, he said, "Claire, I—" He stopped himself, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. The vulnerability in his posture was startling, and it took me a moment to realize that he was just as conflicted as I was. "What?" I prompted, my heart pounding. "What?" His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw the full depth of his turmoil. "Nothing," he said finally, his voice heavy with restraint. "We're done for today." I nodded, though disappointment flooded me as I slid off the table. I grabbed my things and headed for the door, but just as I reached for the handle, his voice stopped me. "Where?" I turned, my breath catching in my throat. He stood there, his expression a mixture of longing and regret. "Take care of yourself," he said, the words laced with a weight that left me reeling. I nodded, unable to speak, and left the room. As I walked to my car, the gravity of what had just happened pressed down on me. Something had shifted again, something that neither of us could undo. And for the first time, I wondered if I even wanted to. The weeks that followed felt like I was walking a tightrope, suspended precariously between reality and the inescapable pull of something I didn't dare name. Every time I thought about Dr. Preston, a rush of guilt followed, tangled with something deeper, something I couldn't deny no matter how hard I tried. I told myself to move on, to focus on my marriage, my life, but it was impossible. His voice, his touch, his eyes, they haunted me, slipping into my thoughts when I least expected it. I didn't anticipate hearing from him again. After all, there was nothing else to discuss. No further appointments, no outstanding issues with my health. But one evening, as I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, my phone buzzed. Seeing his name on the screen stopped my breath. "Hello?" I answered, my voice barely audible. "Claire, it's Dr. Preston." His tone was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it that I couldn't ignore. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "No, not at all," I said, quickly, my heart pounding. "I've been reviewing your tests again," he began, though there was something in his voice that suggested this wasn't the real reason for his call. "I'd like to discuss a few things in person, if you're available." The logical part of me screamed to decline, to make an excuse, but the part of me that had been longing for this connection overpowered my reason. Yes, I can come by. Tomorrow after hours," he said, the hesitation in his voice almost imperceptible. "We'll have privacy." Privacy. The word hung in the air long after we ended the call, its implications both thrilling and terrifying. I spent the next day in a haze, torn between anticipation and dread. By the time the sun began to set, I could barely keep my hands steady as I got into my car. The clinic was dark when I arrived, the parking lot empty except for his car. My heels clicked softly against the pavement as I approached the door, my nerves fraying with every step. When I pushed it open, the bell above barely made a sound, as though even it understood the weight of the moment. Sitting in the dark chair, Holly looked at her phone, and there was distraction in her voice, some release coming from her body. Dr. Preston was waiting in his office, standing by the window again, his silhouette illuminated by the warm glow of the desk lamp. When he turned to look at me, his expression was guarded, but tender, and I felt the air leave my lungs. "Where?" he said softly, gesturing for me to sit. "Thank you for coming," I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and lowered myself into the chair across from him. He sat as well, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together as though he were trying to keep them steady. "I owe you an apology," he began, his voice low but steady, "for overstepping during your last visit. It was unprofessional." My throat tightened. "You didn't—" "Oh, I did," he interrupted gently, his eyes locking onto mine. "But what's more concerning is that I wanted to, that I still do." The confession hung in the air, the finality of his words settling over us like a heavy blanket. My breath quickened, but I didn't look away. "What? Did you call me here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned back slightly, exhaling as though he'd been holding his breath for hours. "Because I can't seem to let this go. Whatever this is between us, it's wrong, but it's real." The room seemed to shrink, the space between us closing in until it felt like we were the only two people in the world. I should have been appalled, should have gotten up and walked out, but I couldn't move. His words echoed the ones I'd been too afraid to admit to myself. "I don't know what to say," I murmured, my hands trembling in my lap. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just needed you to know." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening, but it was filled with unspoken words, with everything we weren't brave enough to admit out loud. When he finally stood and crossed the room, my pulse spiked, and I felt frozen in place. He stopped in front of me, his eyes searching mine. "If you want me to step back, to let this go, tell me now. I'll respect it." I should have said yes. I should have told him to end this before it went any further. But instead I stood, my breath shallow, and took a step toward him. "I don't know what I want," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I don't want to leave." His expression softened, a mixture of relief and hesitation crossing his face. Slowly, as though giving me every opportunity to stop him, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. The touch was feather light, but it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't suppress. "Claire," he said, his voice barely audible, "if we do this, there's no going back." "I know," I whispered, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. And then, as though the tension between us had finally snapped, he closed the distance. His hands cupped my face, and his lips met mine in a kiss that was both tentative and desperate. Years of restraint dissolving in an instant. The world outside the room ceased to exist. There was only him, his warmth, his touch, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. When we finally broke apart, his forehead rested against mine, both of us breathing heavily. His hands slid down to my shoulders, steadying me as though I might collapse. "What now?" I asked, my voice shaky. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine. "Now, we figure this out together." The words shouldn't have brought comfort, But they did. For the first time in years, I felt seen, felt wanted. And though the path ahead was uncertain, I knew I couldn't walk away from this. Not now, not ever.